I was muted. Alright, I should probably move my mic closer to me. One sec. I was not prepared because I am running late, so my apologies. Hopefully you can hear me a little better now. Alright, we have... I am running super late because Super Munchkin is in town, and Super Munchkin comes before everyone else. She outranks everybody in the whole world, so we go by her schedule for the summer. Sorry about that, guys. She is out of the house right now, so there should only be the usual interruptions unless she gets home before I finish. There should be copper and onyx and road noise and things like that. My apologies, as always. We are on chapter 8 of part 2 of book 4. So we will start, and the chapter is called Beneath the Peddler's Moon. The town of Ritzy, nearly 400 miles west of Mayhees, was anything but. Roy DePape reached it 3 nights before the Peddler's Moon, called Late Summer's Moon by some came full and left it a day later. Ritzy was, in fact, a miserable little mining village on the eastern slope of the Vicastis Mountains, about 50 miles from Vicastis Cut. The town had but one street. It was engraved with iron-hard wheel ruts now, and would become a lake of mud roughly 3 days after the storms of autumn set in. There was the Bear and Turtle Mercantile, and sundry items, where miners were forbidden by the V. Castis Company to shop, and a company store where no one but grubbies would shop. There was a combined jailhouse and the town gathering hall with a windmill gallows out front. There were 6 roaring bar rooms, each more sordid, desperate, and dangerous than the last. Ritzy was like an ugly lowered head between a pair of huge shrugged shoulders, the foothills. Above town to the south were the clapped-out shacks where the company housed its miners. Each puff of breeze brought the stench of their unlimed communal privies. To the north were the mines themselves, dangerous, undershored catch drifts that went down 50 feet or so and then spread like fingers clutching for gold and silver and copper and the occasional nest of fire dims. From the outside, they were just holes punched into the bare and rocky earth, holes like staring eyes, each with its own pile of till and scrappings beside the adit. Once there had been freehold mines up there, but they were all gone, regulated out by the V. Castis Company. DePape knew all about it because the big coffin hunters had been a part of that little spin and rary. Just after he'd hooked up with Jonas and Reynolds, that had been. Why, they hadn't gotten those coffin tattoos on their hands not 50 miles from here, in the town of Wind, a mud pin even less ritzy than ritzy. How long ago? He couldn't rightly say, although it seemed to him that he should be able to. But when it came to reckoning times past, DePape often felt lost. It was hard even to remember how old he was, because the world had moved on and time was different now. Softer. One thing he had no trouble remembering at all. His recollection was refreshened by the miserable flare of pain he suffered each time he bumped his wounded finger. That one thing was a promise to himself, that he would see Dearborn, Stockworth, and Heath laid out dead in a row. Hand to outstretched hand, like a little girl's paper dolls. He intended to unlimber the part of him which had longed so bootlessly for her nibs these last 3 weeks, and use it to hose down their dead faces. The majority of his squirt would be saved for Arthur Heath of Gilead, New Canaan. That laughing chatterbox motherfucker had a serious hosing down coming. DePape rode out the sunrise end of Ritzy's only street, trotted his horse up the flank of the first hill and paused at the top for a single look back. Last night, when he'd been talking to the old bastard behind Haddinghan's, Ritzy had been roaring. This morning at 7, it looked as ghostly as the Peddler's Moon, which still hung in the sky above the rim of the plundered hills. He could hear the mines tink-tonking away, though. You bet. Those babies tink-tonked away 7 days a week. No rest for the wicked, and he supposed that included him. He dragged his horse's head around with his usual unthinking and ham-handed force, booted its flanks, and headed east, thinking of the old bastard as he went. He had treated the old bastard passing fair, he reckoned. A reward had been promised, and had been paid for the information given. Yar, de Pape said, his glasses flashing in the new sun. It was a rare morning when he had no hangover, and he felt quite cheerful. I reckon the old bugger can't complain. De Pape had no trouble following the young Coles' back trail. They had come east on the great road the whole way from New Canaan, it appeared, and at every town where they had stopped, they had been marked. In most, they were not marked if they did no more than pass through, and why not? Young men on good horses, no scars on their faces, no regular tattoos on their hands, good clothes on their back, expensive hats on their head. They were remembered especially well at the inns and saloons where they had stopped to refresh themselves, but had drank no hard liquor, no beer or graff either, for that matter. Yes, they were remembered. Boys of the road, boys that seem almost to shine, as if they had come from an earlier and better time. Piss in their faces, de Pape thought as he rode, one by one. Mr. Arthur, ha, Heath, last. I'll save enough so it'd drown you, were you not already at the end of the path and into that clearing. They had been noticed all right, but that wasn't good enough. If he went back to Hamry with no more than that, Jonas would likely shoot his nose off, and he would deserve it. They may be rich boys, but that's not all they are. De Pape had said that himself. The question was, what else were they? And finally, in the shit and sulfur stench of Ritzy, he had found out. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to allow him to turn his horse around before he found himself all the way back in fucking New Canaan. He had hit 2 other saloons, sipping watered beer in each, before rolling into Hattigan's. He ordered yet another watered beer, and prepared to engage the bartender in conversation. Before he even began to shake the tree, however, the apples he wanted fell off and dropped into his hand, neat as you please. It was an old man's voice, an old bastard's voice, speaking with the shrill, head-hurting intensity which is the sole province of old bastards in their cups. He was talking about the old days, an old bastard always did, and about how the world had moved on and how things had been ever so much better when he was a boy. Then he had said something which caused de Pape's ears to prick up, something about how the old days might be coming again, for hadn't he seen 3 young lords not 2 months agone, mayhap less, and even bought one of them a drink, even if it 'twas only a saparilli soda. You wouldn't know a young lord from a young turd, said a miss who appeared to have all of 4 teeth left in her charming young head. There was general laughter at this. The old bastard looked around, offended. I know, all right, he said. I've forgot more than you'll ever learn, so have I. One of them at least came from the Eld line, for I saw his father in his face just as clear as I see your saggy tits, Jolene. And then the old bastard had done something de Pape rather admired. Yanked out the front of the saloon whore's blouse and poured the remainder of his beer down it. Even the roars of laughter and heavy applause which greeted this couldn't entirely down the girl's caw of rage, or the old man's cries when she began to slap and punch him about the head and shoulders. These latter cries were only indignant at first, but when the girl grabbed the old bastard's own beer stein and shattered it against the side of his head, they became screams of pain. Blood, mixed with a few watery dregs of beer, began to run down the old bastard's face. Get out of here, she yelled, and gave him a shove toward the door. Several healthy kicks from the miners and attendants, who had changed sides as easily as the wind changes direction, helped him along. And don't come back. I can smell the weed on your breath, you old cocksucker. Get out and take your God's cursed stories of old ladies and young lords with you. The old bastard was in such a manner conveyed across the room, past the tootling trumpet player who served as entertainment for the patrons of Hattigan's. The young bowler-hatted worthy added his own kick in the seat of the old bastard's dusty trousers without ever missing so much as a single note of play, ladies, play, and out of the bat-wing doors, where he collapsed face first, into the street. De Pape had sauntered after him and helped him up. As he did so, he smelled an acrid odor, not beer, on the old man's breath, and saw the telltale greenish-gray discolorations at the corner of his lips. Weed, all right. The old bastard was probably just getting started on it, and for the usual reason. Devil's grass was free in the hills, unlike the beer and whiskey that was sold in town. But once they started, The finish came quick. "They got no respect," the old bastard said thickly, "nor understanding either." "Aye, so they don't," said DePape, who had not yet gotten the accent of the sea-coast and the drop out of his speech. The old bastard stood, swaying, looking up at him, wiping ineffectually at the blood which ran down the wrinkled cheeks from his lacerated scalp. "Son, do you have the price of a drink? Remember the face of your father and give an old soul the price of a drink." "I'm not much for charity, old-timer," DePape said, "but mayhap you could earn yourself the price of a drink. Step on over here into my office and let us see." He led the old bastard out of the street and back to the boardwalk, angling well to the left of the black bat wings with their golden shafts of light spilling out above and below. He waited for the trio of miners to go by, singing at the top of their lungs, "Woman I love is long and tall, she moves her body like a cannonball." And then, still holding the old bastard by the elbow, he guided him into the alley between Hattigan's and the undertaking establishment next door. For some people, DePape mused, a visit to Ritzy could damn near amount to one-stop shopping. Get your drink, get your bullet, get laid out next door. "Your office," the old bastard cackled as DePape led him down the alley toward the board fence and the heaps of rubbish at the far end. The wind blew, stinging DePape's nose with odors of sulfur and carbolic from the mines. From their right, the sounds of drunken revelry pounded through the side of Hattigan's. "Your office, that's good." "Aye, my office." The old man gazed at him in the light of the moon, which rode the slot of the sky above the alley. "Are you from Mejis or Tepache?" "Maybe one, maybe the other, maybe neither." "Do I know you?" The old bastard was looking at him even more closely, standing on tiptoe as if hoping for a kiss. "Ugh." DePape pushed him away. "Not so close, Dad." Yet he felt marginally encouraged. He and Jonas and Reynolds had been here before, and if the old man remembered his face, likely he wasn't talking through his hat about fellows he'd seen much more recently. "Tell me about the 3 young lords, old Dad." DePape rapped on the wall of Hattigan's. "Them in there may not be interested, but I am." The old bastard looked at him with a bleary, calculating eye. "Might there be a bit of metal in it for me?" "Yar," DePape said. "If you tell me what I want to hear, I'll give you metal." "Gold?" "Tell me and we'll see." "No, sir. Dicker first, tell second." DePape seized him by the arm, whirled him around, and yanked a wrist which felt like a bundle of sticks up to the old bastard's scrawny shoulder blades. "Fuck with me, Dad, and we'll start by breaking your arm." "Let go!" the old bastard screamed breathlessly. "Let go! I'll trust to your generosity, young sir, for you have a generous face. Yes, yes, indeed." DePape let him go. The old bastard eyed him warily, rubbing his shoulder. In the moonlight, the blood drying on his cheeks looked black. 3 of them, there were. And I just lost my space while I was grabbing water, so give me a second. 3 of them there were, he said. "Fine-born lads." "Lads or lords? Which is it, Dad?" The old bastard had taken the question thoughtfully. The whack on the head, the night air, and having his arm twisted seemed to have sobered him up, at least temporarily. "Both, I do believe," he said. "One was a lord for sure, whether them in there believe it or not, for I saw his father, and his father bore the guns. Not such poor things such as you wear, begging your pardon. I know they're the best to be had these days, but real guns, such as were seen when my own dad was a boy. The big ones with the sandalwood grips." DePape had stared at the old man, feeling a rise of excitement and a species of reluctant awe as well. "They acted like gunslingers," Jonas had said. When Reynolds protested they were too young, Jonas had said they might be apprentices, and now it seemed the boss had likely been right. "Sandalwood grips?" he had asked. "Sandalwood grips, old Dad." "Yep." The old man saw his excitement and his belief. He expanded visibly. "A gunslinger, you mean? The one young fellow's father carried the big irons." "Yep, a gunslinger. One of the last lords. Their line is passing now, but my dad knew him well enough. Stephen Deshane of Gilead. Stephen, son of Henry." And this one you saw not long ago. His son, Henry the Tall's grandson. The others looked well-born, as if they might also come from the line of lords, but the one I saw come down all the way from Arthur Eld, by one line or another, sure as you walk on two legs. Have I earned my medal yet? DePape thought to say yes, then realized he didn't know which 3 of the Coles this old bastard was talking about. 3 young men, he mused, 3 highborns, and did they have guns? Not out where the drift diggers of this town could see 'em, the old bastard said and laughed nastily. But they had 'em all right, probably hid in their bedrolls. I'd set my watch and warrant on it. Aye, DePape said, I suppose you would. 3 young men, one the son of a lord, of a gunslinger, you think, Stephen of Gilead? And the name was familiar to him. Aye, it was. Stephen Deshane of Gilead, that's it. And what name did he give, this young lord? The old bastard had screwed his face up alarmingly in an effort to remember. Deerfield? Deerstein? I don't quite remember. That's all right. I know it. And you've earned your medal. Have I? The old bastard had edged close again, his breath gagging sweet with the weed. Gold or silver, which is it, my friend? Lead, DePape replied, then hauled leather and shot the old man twice in the chest. Doing him a favor, really. Now he rode back toward Mahy's. It would be a faster trip without having to stop in every dipshit little town and ask questions. There was a flurry of wings close above his head. A pigeon, dark gray it was, with a white ring around its neck, fluttered down on a rock just ahead of him as if to rest. An interesting-looking bird. Not, DePape thought, a wild pigeon, someone's escaped pet. He couldn't imagine anyone in this desolate quarter of the world keeping anything but a half-wild dog to bite the squash off any would-be robber, although what these folks might have worth robbing was another question he couldn't answer, but he supposed anything was possible. In any case, roast pigeon would go down a treat when he stopped for the night. DePape drew his gun, but before he could cock the hammer, the pigeon was off and flying east. DePape took a shot after it anyway. Sometimes you got lucky, but apparently not this time. The pigeon dipped a little, then straightened out and disappeared in the direction DePape himself was going. He sat astride his horse for a moment, not much put out of countenance. He thought Jonas was going to be very pleased with what he had found out. After a bit, he booted his horse in the sides and began to canter east along the Berenice Road, back towards Mahy's, where the boys who had embarrassed him were waiting to be dealt with. Lords they might be, sons of gunslingers they might be, but in these latter days, even such as those could die. As the old bastard himself would undoubtedly have pointed out, the world had moved on. On a late afternoon, 3 days after Roy DePape left Ritzy and headed his horse towards Hanbury again, Roland, Cuthbert, and Elaine rode north and west of town, first down the long swell of the drop, then into the free land Hamry folk called the Bad Grass, then into deserty wastelands. Ahead of them, and clearly visible once they were back in the open, were crumbled and eroded bluffs. In the center of these was a dark, almost vaginal cleft, its edges so splintered it looked as if it had been whacked into reality by an ill-tempered god wielding a hatchet. The distance between the end of the drop and the bluffs was perhaps 6 miles. 3/4 of the way across, they passed the flatlands, only real geographic feature, a jutting upthrust of rock that looked like a finger bent at the first knuckle. Below it was a small boomerang-shaped greensward, and when Cuthbert gave a ululating yell to hear his voice bounce back at him from the bluffs ahead, a pack of chattering billy bumblers broke from the green place and went racing back southeast toward the drop. That's Hanging Rock, Roland said. There's a spring at the base of it. Only one of these parts, they say. It was all the talk that passed between them on the ride out, but a look of unmistakable relief passed between Cuthbert and Elaine behind Roland's back. For the last 3 weeks had been pretty much marched in place as summer rolled them and past them. It It was all well for Roland to say they must wait. They must pay greatest attention to the things that didn't matter and count the things which did from the corners of their eyes, but neither of them quite trusted the dreamy, disconnected air which Roland wore these days like his own special version of Clay Reynolds' cloak. They didn't talk about this between themselves. They didn't have to. Both knew that if Roland began courting this pretty girl whom Mayor Thorin meant for his gilly, and who else could that long blonde hair have belonged to, they would be in very bad trouble. But Roland showed no courting plumage. Neither of them spied any more blonde hairs on the shirt collars, and tonight he seemed more himself, as if he had put the cloak of abstraction aside. Temporarily, mayhap. Permanently, if they were lucky. They could only wait and see. In the end, Caw would tell, as it always did. A mile or so from the bluffs, the strong sea breeze, which had been at their backs for the whole ride, suddenly dropped, and they heard the low, atonal squalling from the cleft that was Eyebolt's Canyon. Elaine pulled up, grimacing like a man who had bitten into a fruit of extravagant sourness. All he could think of was a handful of sharp pebbles, squeezed and ground together in a strong hand. Buzzards circled above the canyon as if drawn to the sound. "The lookout don't like it, Will," Cuthbert said, knocking his knuckles on the skull. "I don't like it much either. What are we out here for?" "To count," Roland said. "We were sent to count everything and see everything, and this is something to count and see." "Oh, aye," Cuthbert said. He held his horse in with some effort. The low grinding wail of the thinny had made it skittish. 1,614 fishing nets, 710 boats small, 214 large, 70 oxen that nobody will admit to, and, on the north of town, 1 thinny, whatever the hell that is. "We're going to find out," Roland said. They rode into the Sound, and although none of them liked it, no one suggested they go back. They had come all the way out here, and Roland was right. This was their job. Besides, they were curious. The mouth of the canyon had been pretty well stopped up with brush, as Susan had told Roland it would be. Come fall, most of it would probably be dead, but now the stacked branches still bore leaves and made it hard to see into the canyon. A path led through the center of the brush pile, but it was narrow. It was narrow for the horses, who might have balked at going through anyway. And in the failing light, Roland could make out hardly anything. "Are we going in?" Cuthbert asked. Let the recording angel note that I'm against, although I'll offer no mutiny." Roland had no intention of taking them through the brush and toward the source of that sound, not when he had only the vaguest idea of what a thinny was. He had asked a few questions about it over the last few weeks and gotten little useful response. "I'd stay away," was the extent of Sheriff Avery's advice. So far, his best information was still what he had gotten from Susan on the night he met her. "Sit easy, Bert. We're not going in." "Good," Elaine said softly, and Roland smiled. There was a path up the canyon's west side, steep and narrow but passable if they were careful. They went single file, stopping once to clear a rockfall, pitching splintered chunks of shale and hornfells into the groaning trench to their right. When this was done, and just as the three of them were preparing to mount up again, a large bird of some sort, perhaps a grouse, perhaps a prairie chicken, rose above the lip of the canyon in an explosive whir of feathers. Roland dipped for his guns and saw both Cuthbert and Elaine doing the same. Quite funny, considering that their firearms were wrapped in protective oilcloth and secreted beneath the floorboards of the Barkay bunkhouse. They looked at each other, said nothing except with their eyes, which said plenty, and went on. Roland found that the effect of being this close to the thinny was cumulative. It wasn't a sound you could get used to, quite the contrary. In fact, the longer you were in the immediate vicinity of Eyebolt Canyon, the more the sound scraped away at your brain. It got into your teeth as well as your ears. It vibrated in the knot of nerves below the breastbone and seemed to eat the damp and delicate tissue behind the eyes. Most of all, though, it got into your head. telling you that everything you had ever been afraid of was just behind the next curve of the trail, or yonder pile of tumbled rocks waiting to snake out of its place and get you. Once they got to the flat and barren ground at the top of the path and the sky opened out above them again, it was a little better, but by then the light was almost gone, and when they dismounted and walked to the canyon's crumbling edge, they could see little but shadows. "No good," Cuthbert said disgustedly. "We should have left earlier, Roland. What dummies we are. I can be Roland to you out here, if you like, and we'll see what we came to see and count what we came to count. One thinny, just as you said. Only wait." They waited, and not 20 minutes later the peddler's moon rose above the horizon, a perfect summer moon, huge and orange. It loomed in the darkening violet swim of the sky like a crashing planet. On its face, as clear as anyone had ever seen it, was the peddler, he who came out of the nuns, with his sack full of squealing souls, a hunched figure made of smudged shadows, with a pack clearly visible over one cringing shoulder. Behind it, the orange light seemed to flame like hellfire. "Ugh," Cuthbert said. "That's an ill sight to see, with that sound coming up from below." Yet they held their ground, and their horses, which periodically yanked back on their reins as if to tell them they should already be gone from this place, and the moon rose in the sky, shrinking a little as it went and turning silver. Eventually it rose enough to cast its bony light into Eyebolt Canyon. The three boys stood looking down. None of them spoke. Roland didn't know about his friends, but he didn't think he himself could have spoken even if called on to do so. A box canyon, very short and steep-sided, Susan had said, and the description was perfectly accurate. She'd also said Eyebolt looked like a chimney lying on its side, and Roland supposed that was also true, if you allowed that a failing chimney might break up a little on impact and lie with one crooked place in its middle. Up to the crook, the canyon floor looked ordinary enough. Even the litter of bones in the moon showed them was not extraordinary. Many animals which wandered into box canyons hadn't the wit to find their way back out again, and with Eyebolt, the possibility of escape was further reduced by the choke of brush piled at the canyon's mouth. The sides were much too steep to climb, except maybe for one place, just before that crooked little jog. There Roland saw a kind of groove running up the canyon wall, with enough jutting spurs inside it to, maybe, provide handholds. There was no real reason for him to note this. He just did. And he would go on noting potential escape routes his entire life. Beyond the jag and the canyon floor was something none of them had ever seen before, and when they got back to the bunkhouse several hours later, they all agreed that they weren't sure exactly what they had seen. The latter part of Eyebolt Canyon was obscured by a sullen, silvery liquescence form which snakes of smoke or mists were rising in streamers. The liquid seemed to move sluggishly, lapping at the walls which held it in. Later, they would discover that both liquid and mist were a light green. It was only the moonlight that had made them look silver. As they watched, a dark flying shape, perhaps it was the same one that had frightened them before, skimmed down toward the surface of the thinny. It snatched something out of the air, a bug, another smaller bird, and then began to rise again. Before it could, a silvery arm of liquid rose from the canyon floor. For a moment, that soupy, grinding grumble rose a notch and became almost a voice. It snatched the bird out of the air and dragged it down. Greenish light, brief and unfocused, flashed across the surface of the thinny like electricity, and was gone. The three boys stared at each other with frightened eyes. "Jump in, gunslinger," a voice called. It was the voice of the thinny. It was the voice of his father. It was also the voice of Martin, the enchanter, Martin, the seducer. Most terrible of all, it was his own voice. "Jump in and let all these cares cease. There is no love of girls to worry you here, and no mourning of lost mothers to weigh your child's heart. Only the hum of the growing cavity at the center of the universe, only the punky sweetness of rotting flesh. Come, gunslinger, be a part of the thinny." Dreamy-faced and blank-eyed, Elaine began walking along the edge of the drop, his right boot so close to it that the heel puffed little clouds of dust over the chasm and sent clusters of pebbles down into it. Before he could get more than 5 steps, Roland grabbed him by the belt and yanked him roughly back. "Where do you think you're going?" Elaine looked at him with sleepwalker's eyes. They began to clear, but slowly. "I don't know, Roland." Below them, the thinny hummed and growled and sang. There was a sound as well, an oozing, sludgy mutter. "I know," Cuthbert said. "I know where we're all going. Back to the Barquet. Come on, let's get out of here." He looked pleadingly at Roland. "Please, it's awful." "All right." But before he led them back to the path, he stepped to the edge and looked down at the smoky silver ooze below him, counting. He said with a kind of clear defiance, "Counting 1 thinny," then lowered his voice, "and be damned to you." Their composure returned as they rode back. The sea breeze in their faces was wonderfully restorative after the dead and somehow baked smell of the canyon and the thinny. As they rode up the drop on a long diagonal so as to save the horses a little, Elaine said, "What do we do next, Roland? Do you know?" "No, as a matter of fact, I don't." "Supper would be a start," Cuthbert said brightly, and tapped the lookout's hollow skull for emphasis. "You know what I mean." "Yes," Cuthbert agreed, "and I'll tell you something, Roland." "Will, please. Now that we're back on the drop, let me be Will." "Aye, fine. I'll tell you something, Will. We can't go on counting nets and boats and looms and wheel irons much longer. We're running out of things that don't matter. I believe that looking stupid will become a good deal harder once we move to the horse-breeding side of life as it's lived in Hanbury." "Aye," Roland said. He stopped Rusher and looked back the way they had come. He was momentarily enchanted by the sight of horses, apparently infected with a kind of moon madness, frolicking and racing across the silvery grass. "But I tell you both again, this is not just about horses. Does Farson need them? Aye, mayhap. So does the affiliation, oxen as well. But there are horses everywhere. Perhaps not as good as these, I'll admit, but any port does in a storm, so they say. So if it's not horses, what is it? Until we know or decide we'll never know, we go on as we are." Part of the answer was waiting for them back at the Barquet. It was perched on the hitching rail and flicking its tail saucily. When the pigeon hopped into Roland's hand, he saw that one of its wings was oddly frayed. Some animal, likely a cat, had crept up on it close enough to pounce, he reckoned. The note curled against the pigeon's leg was short, but it explained a good deal of what they hadn't understood. "I'll have to see her again," Roland thought after reading it, and felt a surge of gladness. His pulse quickened, and in the cold silver light of the peddler's moon, he smiled. Chapter 9. Sitco. The peddler's moon began to wane. It would take the hottest, fairest part of the summer with it when it went. On an afternoon, 4 days past the full, the old mozo from the mayor's house, Miguel had been there long before Hart Thorin's time, and would likely be there long after Thorin had gone back to his ranch, showed up at the house Susan shared with her aunt. He was leading a beautiful chestnut mare by a hack. It was the second of the 3 promised horses, and Susan recognized Felicia at once. The mayor had been one of her childhood favorites. Susan embraced Miguel and covered his bearded cheeks with kisses. The old man's wide grin would have showed every tooth in his head if he'd had any left to show. "Gracias, gracias. 1,000 thanks, old father," she told him. "De nada," he replied, and handed her the bridle. "It's the mayor's earnest gift." She watched him away, the smile slowly fading from her lips. Felicia stood docilely beside her, her dark brown coat shining like a dream in the summer sunlight. But this was no dream. It had seemed like one at first. The sense of unreality had been another inducement to walk into the trap. she now understood. But it was no dream. She had been proved honest. Now she found herself the recipient of earnest gifts from a rich man. The phrase was a sop to conventionality, of course, or a bitter joke, depending on one's mood and outlook. Felicia was no more a gift than Pylon had been. They were step-by-step fulfillments of the contract into which she had entered. Aunt Cord could express shock, but Susan knew the truth. What lay directly ahead was whoring, pure and simple. Aunt Cord was in the kitchen window as Susan walked her gift, which was really just her returned property in her view, to the stable. She called out something passing cheery about how the horse was a good thing, that caring for it would give Susan less time for her McGrims. Susan felt a hot reply rise to her lips and held it back. There had been a weary truce between the two of them since the shouting match about the shirts, and Susan didn't want to be the one to break it. There was too much on her mind and heart. She thought that one more argument with her aunt, and she might simply snap like a dry twig under a boot. Because often silence is best, her father had told her when, at age 10 or so, she had asked him why he was always so quiet. The answer had puzzled her then, but now she understood better. She stabled Felicia next to Pylon, rubbed her down, fed her, while the mayor munched oats. Susan examined her hooves. She didn't care much for the look of the iron the mayor was wearing. That was seafront for you. And so she took her father's shoe bag from its nail beside the stable door, slung the strap over her head and shoulder so the bag hung on her hip, and walked the 2 miles to Hookie's stable in fancy livery. Feeling the leather bag bang against her hip brought back her father in a way so fresh and clear that the grief pricked her again and made her feel like crying. She thought he would have been appalled at her current situation, perhaps even disgusted, and he would have liked Will Dearborn. Of that she was sure. Liked him and approved of him for her. It was the final, miserable touch. She had known how to shoe most of her life and even enjoyed it when her mood was right. It was dusty, elemental work, with always the possibility of a healthy kick in the slats to relieve the boredom and bring a girl back to reality. But of making shoes she knew nothing, nor wished to. Brian Hookie made them at the forge behind his barn in Hull Street, however. Susan easily picked out 4 new ones of the right size, enjoying the smell of the horseflesh and fresh hay as she did. Fresh paint, too. Hookie's stable and Smithy's looked very well indeed. Glancing up, she saw not so much as a single hole in the barn roof. Times had been good for Hookie, it seemed. He wrote the new shoes up on a beam, still wearing his blacksmith's apron and squinting horribly out of one eye at his own fingers. When Susan began to speak haltingly to him about payment, he laughed, told her he knew she'd settle her accounts as soon as she could. God's bless her, yes. Sides, they weren't any of them going anywhere, were they? Nop, all the time gently propelling her through the fragrant smells of hay and horses toward the door. He would not have treated her even so small a matter as 4 iron shoes in such a carefree manner a year ago, but now she was Mayor Thorne's good friend, and things had changed. The afternoon sunlight was dazzling after the dimness of Hookie's barn, and she was momentarily blinded, groping forward toward the street with the leather bag bouncing on her hip and the shoes clashing softly inside. She had just a moment to register a shape looming in the brightness, and then it bumped into her hard enough to rattle her teeth and make Felicia's new shoes clang. She would have fallen, but for strong hands that quickly reached out and grasped her shoulders. By then her eyes were adjusting, and she saw with dismay and amusement that the young man who had almost knocked her sprawling into the dirt was one of Will's friends, Richard Stockworth. "Oh, Cy, your pardon," he said, brushing the arm of her dress as if he had knocked her over. "Are you well? Are you quite well?" "Quite well," she said, smiling. "Please don't apologize." She felt a sudden wild impulse to stand on tiptoe and kiss his mouth and say, "Give that to Will and tell him to never mind what I said. Tell him there are 1,000 more where that came from. Tell him to come and get every one." Indeed, she fixed on a comic image, this Richard Stockworth smacking Will full on the mouth and saying it was from Susan Delgado, and she began to giggle. She put her hands to her mouth, but it did no good. Cy Stockworth smiled back at her, tentatively, cautiously. He probably thinks I'm mad. And I am. I am. Good day, Mr. Stockworth, she said, and passed on before she could embarrass herself further. Good day, Susan Delgado, he called in return. She looked back once, when she was 50 yards or so farther up the street, but he was already gone. Not into hookies, though, of that she was quite sure. She wondered what Mr. Stockworth had been doing at the end of town to begin with. Half an hour later, as she took the new iron from her dad's shoe bag, she found out. There was a folded scrap of paper tucked between two of the shoes, and even before she unfolded it, she understood that her collision with Mr. Stockworth hadn't been an accident. She recognized Will's handwriting at once, from the note in the bouquet. Susan, can you meet me at Citgo this evening or tomorrow evening? Very important. Has to do with what we discussed before. Please. W. P.S. Best you burn this note. She burned it at once, and as she watched the flames first flash up and then die down, she murmured over and over the one word in which had struck her the hardest. Please. She and Aunt Cord ate a simple, silent evening meal, bread and soup, and when it was done, Susan rode Felicia out to the drop and watched the sun go down. She would not be meeting him this evening. No. She already owed too much sorrow to impulsive, unthinking behavior, but tomorrow. Why Citgo? It has to do with what we discussed before. Yes, probably. She did not doubt his honor, although she had much come to wonder if he and his friends were who they said they were. He probably did want to see her for some reason which bore on his mission, although how the oil patch could have anything to do with too many horses on the drop she did not know. But there was something between them now, something sweet and dangerous. They might start off talking, but would likely end up kissing, and kissing would just be the start. Knowing didn't change feeling, though. She wanted to see him, needed to see him. So she sat astride her new horse, another of Hartthorne's payments in advance on her virginity, and watched the sun swell and turn red in the west. She listened to the faint grumble of the thinny, and for the first time in her 16 years was truly torn by indecision. All she wanted stood against all she believed of honor, and her mind roared with conflict. Around all, like a rising wind around an unstable house, she felt the idea of Ka growing. Yet, to give over one's honor for that reason was so easy, wasn't it? To excuse the fall of virtue by invoking all-powerful Ka, it was soft thinking. Susan felt as blind as she'd been when leaving the darkness of Brian Hookie's barn for the brightness of the street. At one point she cried silently in frustration without even being aware of it, and pervading her every effort to think clearly and rationally was her desire to kiss him again, and to feel his hand cupping her breast. She had never been a religious girl, had little faith in the dim gods of Midworld, so at the last of it, with the sun gone and the sky above it a point of exit going from red to purple, she tried to pray to her father, and an answer came, although whether from him or from her own heart, she didn't know. Let Ka mind itself, the voice in her mind said. It will anyway, it always does. If Ka should overrule your honor, so it will be. In the meantime, Susan, there's no one to mind it but yourself. Let Ka go, and mind the virtue of your promise, hard as that may be. All right, she said. In her current state, she discovered that any decision, even one that would cost her another chance to see Will, was a relief. I'll honor my promise, and Ka can take care of itself. In the gathering shadows, she clucked side-mouthed to Felicia and turned for home. The next day was Sunday, the traditional cowboy's day of rest. Roland's little band took this day off as well. It's fair enough that we should, Cuthbert said, since we don't know what the hell we're doing in the first place. On this particular Sunday, the 6th since coming to Hanbury, Cuthbert was in the upper market. Lower market was cheaper by and large, but too fishy-smelling for his liking. Looking at brightly colored sarapes and trying not to cry, for his mother had a sarape. It was a great favorite of hers, and thinking of how she would ride out sometimes with it flowing back from her shoulders and filled him with homesickness so strong it was savage. Arthur Heath, Roland's Kamai, missing his mamma so badly his eyes were wet. It was a joke worthy of Cuthbert Allgood. As he stood so, looking at the sarapes and hanging racks of Delina blankets, with his hands clasped behind his back like a patron in an art gallery, and blinking back tears all the while, there came a light tap on his shoulder. He turned, and there was a girl with blonde hair. Cuthbert wasn't surprised that Roland was smitten with her. She was nothing short of breathtaking, even dressed in jeans and a farm shirt. Her hair was tied back with a series of rough rawhide hanks, and she had eyes of the brightest gray Cuthbert had ever seen. Cuthbert thought it was a wonder that Roland had been able to continue with any other aspect of his life at all, even down to the washing of his teeth. Certainly she came with a cure for Cuthbert. Sentimental thoughts of his mother disappeared in an instant. "Sigh," he said. It was all he could manage, at least to start with. She nodded and held out what the folk of Mahis called a corvette little packet, with the literal definition, little purse, was the practical one. These small leather accessories, big enough for a few coins but not much more, were more often carried by ladies than gentlemen, although that was not a hard and fast rule of fashion. "Ye dropped this, Cully," she said. "Nay, thank ye, Si. This one well might have been the property of a man, plain black leather and unadorned by fou-fras, but he had never seen it before, never carried a corvette for that matter." "It's yours," she said, and her eyes were now so intense that her gaze felt hot on his skin. He should have understood at once, but he had been blinded by her unexpected appearance. Also, he admitted, by her cleverness. You somehow didn't expect cleverness from a girl this beautiful. Beautiful girls did not, as a rule, have to be clever. So far as Bert could tell, all beautiful girls had to do was wake up in the morning. "It is." "Oh, aye," he said, almost snatching the little purse from her. He could feel a foolish grin overspreading his face. "Now that you mention it, Si." "Susan." Her eyes were grave and watchful above her smile. "Let me be Susan to you, I pray." "With pleasure. I cry your pardon, Susan. It's just that my mind and memory, realizing it's Sunday, have joined hands and gone off on holiday together. Eloped, you might say, and left me temporarily without a brain in my head." He might well have rattled on like that for another hour, he had before, to that both Roland and Elaine could testify. But she stopped him with the easy briskness of an older sister. "I can easily believe you have no control over your mind, Mr. Heath, or the tongue hung below it, but perhaps you'll take better care of your purse in the future. Good day." She was gone before he could get another word out. Bert found Roland where he so often was these days, out on the part of the drop that was called Town Lookout by many of the locals. It gave a fair view of Hanbury, dreaming away its Sunday afternoon in a blue haze, but Cuthbert rather doubted the Hanbury view was what drew his oldest friend back there time after time. He thought that its view of the Delgado house was the more likely reason. This day Roland was with Elaine, neither of them saying a word. Cuthbert had no trouble accepting the idea that the people could go long periods of time without talking to each other, but he did not think he would ever understand it. He came riding up to them at a gallop, reached inside his shirt, and pulled out the corvette. "From Susan Delgado. She gave it to me in the upper market. She's beautiful, and she's also as wily as a snake," I say with the utmost admiration. Roland's face filled with light and life when Cuthbert tossed him the corvette. He caught it one-handed and pulled the lace tie with his teeth, inside, where a traveling man would have kept his few scraps of money. There was a single folded piece of paper. Roland read this quickly, the light going out of his eyes, the smile fading off his mouth. "What does it say?" Elaine asked. Roland handed it to him and then went back to looking at the drop. It wasn't until he saw the very real desolation in his friend's eyes that Cuthbert fully realized how far into Roland's life, and hence into all their lives, Susan Delgado had come. Elaine handed him the note. It was only a single line, 2 sentences. "It's best we don't meet. I'm sorry." Cuthbert read it twice, as if rereading might change it, then handed it back to Roland. Roland put the note back into the Corvette, tied the lace, and then tucked the little purse into his own shirt. Cuthbert hated silence worse than danger. It was danger to his mind, but every conversational opening he tried in his mind seemed callow and unfeeling, given the look on his friend's face. It was as if Roland had been poisoned. Cuthbert was disgusted at the thought of that lovely young girl bumping hips with the long and bony mayor of Hambry, but the look on Roland's face now called up stronger emotions. For that, he could hate her. At last, Elaine spoke up, almost timidly. "And now, Roland, shall we have a hunt out there at the oil patch without her?" Cuthbert admired that. Upon first meeting him, many people dismissed Elaine Johns as something of a dullard. That was very far from the truth. Now, in a diplomatic way Cuthbert could never have matched, he had pointed out that Roland's unhappy first experience with love did not change their responsibilities. And Roland responded, raising himself off the saddle horn and sitting up straight. The strong golden light of the summer's afternoon lit his face in harsh contrast, and for the moment that face was haunted by the ghost of a man he would become. Cuthbert saw that ghost and shivered, not knowing what he saw, only knowing that it was awful. "The big coffin hunters," he said. "Do you see them in town?" "Jonas and Reynolds," Cuthbert answered. "Still no sign of DePape. I think Jonas must have choked him and thrown him over the sea cliff in a fit of pique after the night in the bar." Roland shook his head. "Jonas needs the men he trusts too much to waste them. He's as far out on thin ice as we are. No, DePape's just been sent off for a while." "Sent where?" Elaine asked. "Where he'll have to shit in the bushes and sleep in the rain if the weather's bad." Roland laughed shortly, without much humor. "Jonas has got DePape running our back trail, more likely than not." Elaine grunted softly, in surprise that wasn't really surprise. Roland sat easily astride Rusher, looking out over the dreamy depths of the land, the grazing horses. With one hand, he unconsciously rubbed the Corvette he had tucked into his shirt. At last, he looked around at them again. "We'll wait a bit longer," he said. "Perhaps she'll change her mind." "Roland," Elaine began, and his tone was deadly in its gentleness. Roland raised his hand before Elaine could go on. "Doubt me not, Elaine. I speak as my father's son." "All right." Elaine reached out and briefly gripped Roland's shoulder. As for Cuthbert, he reserved judgment. Roland might or might not be acting as his father's son. Cuthbert guessed that at this point Roland hardly knew his own mind at all. "Do you remember what Court used to say was the primary weakness of maggots such as us?" Roland asked, without trace of a smile. "You run without consideration and fall in a hole," Elaine quoted in a gruff imitation that made Cuthbert laugh aloud. Roland's smile broadened a touch. "Aye, they're words I mean to remember, boys. I'll not upset this cart in order—" I'm sorry, one sec. Onyx! Enough! Oh my goodness, I do not... How long have I been on mute? Have I been reading on mute for a long time? Ugh, I'm gonna have to start this one over, aren't I? One sec, I've gotta go back and listen. Yay, I was not on mute. Okay. Onyx finally decided to stop barking too, so we're good on that note. Where were we? Roland's smile broadened a touch. Aye, they're words I mean to remember, boys. I'll not upset this cart in order to see what's in it. Not unless there's no other choice. Susan may come around yet, given time to think. I believe she would have agreed to meet me already, if not for other matters between us. He paused, and for a little while there was a quiet among them. I wish our fathers hadn't sent us, Elaine said at last, although it was Roland's father who had sent them, and all three knew it. We're too young for matters such as these, too young by years. We did all right that night in the rest, Cuthbert said. That was training, not guile, and they didn't take us seriously. That won't happen again. They wouldn't have sent us, not my father, not yours, if they'd known what we'd find, Roland said. But now we've found it, and now we're for it. Yes? Elaine and Cuthbert nodded. They were for it, all right. There no longer seemed any doubt of that. In any case, it's too late to worry about it now. We'll wait and hope for Susan. I'd rather not go near Sitco without someone from Hanbury who knows the lay of the place. But if DePape comes back, we'll have to take our chance. God knows what he may find out, or what stories he may invent to please Jonas, or what Jonas may do after they palaver. There may be shooting. After all this creeping around, I'd almost welcome it, Cuthbert said. Will you send her another note, Will Dearborn? Elaine asked. Roland thought about it. Cuthbert laid an interior bet with himself on which way Roland would go, and lost. No, he said at last. We'll have to give her time, hard as that is, and hope her curiosity will bring her around. With that, he turned Rusher toward the abandoned bunkhouse which now served them as a home, and Cuthbert and Elaine followed. Susan worked herself hard the rest of that Sunday, mucking out the stables, carrying water, washing down all the steps. Aunt Cord watched all this in silence, her expression one of mingled doubt and amazement. Susan cared not a bit for how her aunt looked. She wanted only to exhaust herself and avoid another sleepless night. It was over. Will would know it as well now, and that was to the good. Let done be done. Are you daft, girl? Was all Aunt Cord asked her as Susan dumped her last pail of dirty rinse water behind the kitchen. It's Sunday. Not daft a bit, she replied shortly, without looking around. She accomplished the first half of her aim, going to bed just after moonrise, with tired arms, aching legs, and a throbbing back, but sleep still did not come. She lay in bed, wide-eyed and unhappy. The hours passed, and the moon set, and still Susan couldn't sleep. She looked into the dark and wondered if there was any possibility, even the slightest, that her father had been murdered. To stop his mouth, to close his eyes. Finally, she reached the conclusion that Roland had already come to. If there had been no attraction for her in those eyes of his, or the touch of his hands and lips, she would have agreed in a flash to the meeting he wanted, if only to set her troubled mind to rest. At this realization, relief overspread her, and she was able to sleep. Late the next afternoon, while Roland and his friends were at Fives in the Traveler's Rest, cold beef sandwiches and gallons of white iced tea, not as good as that made by Deputy Dave's wife, but not bad, Shimi came in from outside, where he had been watering his flowers. He was wearing his pink sombrero with a wide grin. In one hand, he held a little packet. "Hello there, you little coffin hunters," he cried cheerfully, and made a bow which was an amusingly good imitation of their own. Cuthbert particularly enjoyed seeing such a bow done in gardening sandals. "How be you? Well, I'm hopping, so I do." I'm hoping so I do. Right as rain barrels, Cuthbert said, but none of us enjoys being called little coffin hunters, so maybe you could just play soft on that, all right? "Aye," Shimi said as cheerfully as ever. "Aye, Mr. Arthur Heath, good fella who saved my life." He paused and looked puzzled for a moment, as if unable to remember why he had approached them in the first place. Then his eyes cleared. His grin shone out, and he held the packet out to Roland. "For you, Will Dearborn." "Really? What is it?" "Seeds, so they are." "From you, Sheemy?" "Oh, no." Roland took the packet. Just an envelope which had been folded over and sealed. There was nothing written on the front or the back, and the tips of his fingers felt no seeds within. "Who from, then?" "Can't remember," said Sheemy, who then cast his eyes aside. His brains had been stirred just enough, Roland reflected, so that he would never be unhappy for long, and would never be able to lie at all. Then his eyes, hopeful and timid, came back to Roland's. "I remember what I was supposed to say to you, though." "I? Then say it, Sheemy." Speaking as one who recites a painfully memorized line, both proud and nervous, he said, "These are the seeds you scattered on the drop." Roland's eyes blazed so fiercely that Sheemy stumbled back a step. He gave his sombrero a quick tug, turned, and hurried back to the safety of his flowers. He liked Will Dearborn and Will's friends, especially Mr. Arthur Heath, who sometimes said things that made Sheemy laugh fit to split. But in that moment, he saw something in Will Sye's eyes that frightened him badly. In that instant, he understood that Will was as much a killer as the one in the cloak, or the one who had wanted Sheemy to lick his boots clean, or old white-haired Jonas with the trembly voice. As bad as them, or even worse. Roland slipped the seed packet into his shirt and didn't open it until the three of them were back on the porch of the Bar K. In the distance, the Thinny grumbled, making their horses twitch their ears nervously. "Well?" Cuthbert asked at last, unable to restrain himself any longer. Roland took the envelope from inside his shirt and tore it open. As he did, he reflected that Susan had known exactly what to say, to a nicety. The others bent in, Elaine from his left and Cuthbert from his right, as he unfolded the single scrap of paper. Again he saw her simple, neatly made writing, the message not much longer than the previous one, very different in content, however. "There is an orange grove a mile off the road on the town side of Sitco. Meet me there at moonrise. Come alone. S." And below that, printed in emphatic little letters, "Burn this." "We'll keep a lookout," Elaine said. Roland nodded. "Aye, but from a distance." Then he burned the note. The orange grove was a neatly kept rectangle of about a dozen rows at the end of a partly overgrown cart track. Roland arrived there before dark, but still a good half hour before the rapidly thinning peddler would haul himself over the horizon once more. As the boys wandered along one of the rows, listening to the somehow skeletal sounds from the oil patch to the north, squealing pistons, grinding gears, thudding drive shafts, he was struck by deep homesickness. It was the fragile fragrance of orange blossoms, a bright runner laid over the darker stench of oil, that brought it on. This toy grove was nothing like the great apple orchards of New Canaan, except somehow it was. There was the same feeling of dignity and civilization here, of much time devoted to something not strictly necessary, and in this case, he suspected, not very useful either. Oranges grown this far north of the warm latitudes were probably almost as sour as lemons. Still, when the breeze stirred the trees, the smell made him think of Gilead with bitter longing, and for the first time he considered the possibility that he might never see home again, that he had become as much a wanderer as the old peddler moon in the sky. He heard her, but not until she was almost on top of him. If she'd been an enemy instead of a friend, he might still have had time to draw and fire, but it would have been close. He was filled with admiration, and as he saw her face in the starlight, he felt his heart gladden. She halted when he turned and merely looked at him, her hands linked before her at her waist in a way that was sweetly and unconsciously childlike. He took a step toward her, and they came up in what he took for alarm. He stopped, confused, but he had misread her gesture in the chancy light. She could have stopped then, but chose not to. She stepped toward him deliberately, a tall young woman in a split riding skirt and plain black boots. Her sombrero hung down over her back and against the bound rope of her hair. Will Dearborn, we are met both fair and ill, she said in a trembling voice, and then he was kissing her. They burned against one another as the peddler rose in the famine of its last quarter. Inside her lonely hut, high on the coast, Rhea sat at the kitchen table, bent over the glass the big coffin hunters had brought her a month and a half ago. Her face was bathed in its pink glow, and no one would have mistaken it for the face of the girl any longer. She had extraordinary vitality, and it had carried her for many years. Only the longest-lived residents of the Hambry had any idea of how old Rhea of Coos actually was, and they only the vaguest. But the glass was finally sapping it, sucking it out of her as a vampire sucks blood. Behind her, the hut's larger room was even dingier and more cluttered than usual. These days, she had no time for even the pretense of cleaning. The glass ball took up all of her time. When she wasn't looking into it, she was thinking of looking into it, and oh, such things she had seen. Ermot twined around one of her scrawny legs, hissing with agitation, but she barely noticed him. Instead, she bent even closer into the ball's poison-pink glow, enchanted by what she saw there. It was the girl who had come to her to be proven honest, and the young man she had seen the first time she'd looked into the ball, the one she'd mistaken for a gunslinger until she'd realized his youth. The foolish girl who had come to Rhea singing and left in a more proper silence had proved honest, and might well be honest yet. Certainly she kissed and touched the boy with the virgin's mingled greed and timidity. But she wouldn't be honest much longer if they kept on the way they were going, and wouldn't Hart Thorin be in for a surprise when he took his supposedly pure young Gilly to bed? There were ways to fool men about that. Men practically begged to be fooled about that. A thimble of pig's blood would serve nicely, but she wouldn't know that. Oh, this would be too good, and to think she could watch Miss Hottie brought low right here in this wonderful glass. Oh, it was too good, too wonderful. She leaned closer still, the deep sockets of her eyes filling with pink fire. Ermot, sensing that she remained immune to his blandishments, crawled discontentedly away across the floor in search of bugs. Musty pranced away from him, spitting feline curses, his six-legged shadow huge and misshapen on the fire-struck wall. Roland sensed the moment rushing at them. Somehow he managed to step away from her, and she stepped back from him, her eyes wide and cheeks flushed. He could see that flush even in the light of the newly risen moon. His balls were throbbing, and his groin felt full of liquid lead. She half turned away from him, and Roland saw that her sombrero had gone askew on her back. He reached out one trembling hand and straightened it. She clasped his fingers in a brief but strong grip, then bent to pick up her riding gloves, which she had stripped off in her need to touch him skin to skin. When she stood again, the wash of blood abruptly left her face, and she reeled, but for his hands on her shoulders, steadying her, she might have fallen. She turned toward him, eyes rueful. "What are we to do? Oh, Will, what are we to do?" "The best we can," he said, "as we both always have, as our fathers taught us. This is mad." Roland, who had never felt anything so sane in his life, even the deep ache in his groin felt sane and right, said nothing. "Do ye know how dangerous it is?" she asked, and went on before he could reply. "Aye, ye do. I can see ye do. If we were seen together at all, 'twould be serious. To be seen as we just were." She shivered. He reached for her, and she stepped back. "Best you don't, Will. If you do, won't be nothing done between us but spoonin', unless that was your intention. You know it wasn't." She nodded. "Have you set your friends to watch?" "Aye," he said, and then his face opened in that unexpected smile she loved so well. "But not where they can watch us." "Thank the gods for that," she said, and laughed rather distractedly. Then she stepped closer to him, so close that he was hard put not to take her in his arms again. She looked curiously up into his face. "Who are you really, Will?" "Almost who I say I am. That's the joke of this, Susan. My friends and I were sent here because we were drunk and helling. But we weren't sent here to uncover any fell plot or secret conspiracy either. We were just boys to be put out of the way in a time of danger. All that's happened since." He shook his head to show how helpless he felt, and Susan thought again of her father saying "Ka" was like a wind. When it came, it might take your chickens, your house, your barn, even your life. "And is Will Dearborn your real name?" He shrugged. "One name's as good as another, I wot, if the heart that answers to it is true. Susan, you were at the mayor's house today, for my friend Richard saw you ride up." "Aye, fittings," she said, "for I am to be this year's reaping girl. It's heart's choice, nothing I ever would have had on my own, mark I say it. A lot of foolishness and hard on Olive as well, I warrant." "You will make the most beautiful reap girl that ever was," he said, and the clear sincerity in his voice made her tingle with pleasure. Her cheeks grew warm again. There were 5 changes of costumes for the reaping girl between the noon feast and the bonfire at dusk, each more elaborate than the last. In Gilead there would have been 9. And in that way, Susan didn't know how lucky she was, and she would have worn all 5 happily for Will, had he been the reaping lad. This year's lad was Jamie McCann, a pallid and whey-faced stand-in for Hart Thorin, who was approximately 40 years too old and gray for the job. Even more happily would she have worn the 6th, a silvery shift with wisp-thin straps, and a hem that stopped high on her thighs. This was a costume no one but Maria, her maid, Conchetta, her seamstress, and Hart Thorin would ever see. It was the one she would be wearing when she went to the old man's couch as his gilly after the feast was over. "When you were up there, did you see the ones who called themselves the Big Coffin Hunters?" "I saw Jonas and the one with the cloak standing together in the courtyard and talking," she said. "Not to Pape, the redhead." She shook her head. "Do you know the game castles, Susan?" "Aye, my father showed me when I was small." "Then you know how the red piece stand at one end of the board and the white at the other, how they come around the hillocks and creep toward each other, setting screens for cover. What's going on here in Hambry is very like that. And, as in the game, it has now become a question of who will break cover first. Do you understand?" She nodded at once. In the game, the first one around his hillock is vulnerable. In life, too. Always. But sometimes even staying in cover is difficult. My friends and I have counted nearly everything we dare count. To count the rest. The horses on the drop, for instance. Aye, just so. To count them would be to break cover. Or the oxen we know about. Her eyebrows shot up. "There are no oxen in Hambry. You must be mistaken about that." "No mistake." "Where?" "The Rocking H." Now her eyebrows drew back down and knitted in a thoughtful frown. "That's Laszlo Reimer's place." "Aye, Kimba's brother." "Nor are those the only treasures hidden away in Hambry these days. There are extra wagons, extra tack hidden in barns belonging to members of the Horsemen's Association, extra caches of feed." "Will, no!" "Yes, all that and more. But to count them, to be seen counting them, is to break cover, to risk being castled. Our recent days have been pretty nightmarish. We try to look profitably busy without moving over to the drop side of Hambry, where most of the danger lies. It's harder and harder to do. Then we received a message." "A message? How? From whom?" "Best you not know these things, I think, but it's led us to believe that some of the answers we're looking for may be at Sitgo." "Will, do you think what's out here may help me to know more about what happened to my da?" "I don't know. It's possible, I suppose, but not likely. All I know for sure is that I finally have a chance to count something that matters and not be seen doing it. His blood had cooled enough for him to hold out his hand to her. Susan's had cooled enough for her to take it in good confidence. She had put her glove back on again, however. Better safe than sorry. "Come on," she said. "I know a path." In the moon's pale half-light, Susan led him out of the orange grove and toward the thump and squeak of the oil patch. Those sounds made Roland's back prickle, made him wish for one of the guns hidden under the bunkhouse floorboards back at the Barquet. You can trust me, Will, but that doesn't mean I'll be much help to ye, she said in a voice just a notch above a whisper. I've been within hearing distance of Sitco my whole life, but I could count the number of times I've actually been in it on the fingers of both hands, so I could. The first 2 or 3 were on dares from my friends. And then? With my da. He was always interested in the old people, and my Aunt Cord always said he'd come to a bad end meddling in their leavings. She swallowed hard. And he did come to a bad end, although I doubt it were the old people responsible. Poor da. They had reached a smooth wire fence. Beyond it, the gantries of the oil wells stood against the sky like centennials the size of Lord Perth. How many had she said were still working? 19, he thought. The sound of them was ghastly, the sound of monsters being choked to death. Of course, it was the kind of place that kids dared each other to go into, a kind of open-air haunted house. He held 2 of the wires apart so she could slip between them, and she did the same for him. As he passed through, he saw a line of white porcelain cylinders marching down the post closest to him. A fence wire went through each. You understand what these are? Were? He asked Susan, tapping one of the cylinders. Aye. When there was electricity, some went through here. She paused, then added shyly, It's how I feel when you touch me. He kissed her cheek just above her ear. She shivered and pressed a hand briefly against his cheek before drawing away. I hope your friends will watch well. They will. Is there a signal? The whistle of the nighthawk. Let's hope we don't hear it. Aye, be it so. She took his hand and drew him into the oil patch. The first time the gas jet flared ahead of them, Will spat a curse under his breath, an obscenely energetic one she hadn't heard since her father died, and dropped the hand not holding hers to his belt. Be easy. It's only the candle, the gas pipe. He relaxed slowly. That they use, don't they? Aye, to run a few machines, little more than toys they are, to make ice mostly. I had some the day we met the sheriff. When the flare licked out again, bright yellow with a bluish core, he didn't jump. He glanced at the 3 gas storage tanks behind what Hambry folk called the candles, without much interest. Nearby was a stack of rusty canisters in which the gas could be bottled and carried. You've seen such before? She asked. He nodded. The inner baronies must be very strange and wonderful, Susan said. I'm beginning to think they're no stranger than those of the outer ark, he said, turning slowly. He pointed. What's yon building down there? Left over from the old people? Aye. To the east of Sitco, the ground dropped sharply down a thickly wooded slope, with a lane cut through the middle of it. This lane was as clear in the moonlight as a part in hair. Not far from the bottom of the slope was a crumbling building surrounded by rubble. The tumble and strew was the detritus of many fallen smokestacks. That much could be extrapolated from the one which stood still. Whatever else the old people had done, they had made lots of smoke. There were useful things in there when my da was a child, she said, paper and such, even a few ink writers that would still work. For a little while, at least, if you shook them hard. She pointed to the left of the building, where there was a vast square of crumbled paving and a few rusting hulks that had been the old people's weird, horseless mode of travel. Once there were things over there that looked like the gas storage tanks, only much, much larger, like huge silver cans they were. They didn't rust like those that are left. I can't think of what became of them unless someone hauled them off for water storage. I never would. 'Twould be unlucky, even if it weren't contaminated. She turned her face up to his, and he kissed her mouth in the moonlight. Oh, Will, what a pity this is for you. What a pity for the both of us, he said, and then passed between them one of those long and aching looks of which only teenagers are capable. They looked away at last and walked on again, hand in hand. She couldn't decide which frightened her more, the few derricks that were still pumping or the dozens which had fallen silent. One thing she knew for sure was that no power on the face of this earth could have gotten her within the fence of this place without a friend close by her. The pumps wheezed. Every now and then a cylinder screamed like someone being stabbed. At periodic intervals the candle would fire off with a sound like dragon's breath, throwing their shadows out long in front of them. Susan kept her ears pitched for the nighthawk's piercing two-note whistle, and heard nothing. They came to a wide lane, where there had once undoubtedly been a maintenance road that split the oil patch in two. Running down the center was a steel pipe with rusting joints. It lay in a deep concrete trough with the upper arc of its rusty circumference protruding above ground level. "What's this?" he asked. "The pipe that took the oil to yon building, I reckon. It means nothing. 'Tis been dry for years." He dropped to one knee, slid his hand carefully into the space between the concrete sleeve and the pipe's rusty side. She watched him, nervously biting her lip to keep herself from saying something which would surely come out sounding weak or womanish. What if there were biting spiders down there in the forgotten dark? Or what if his hand got stuck? What would they do then? Of that latter there had been no chance. She saw when he pulled his hand free. It was slick and black with oil. "Dry for years," he said with a little smile. She could only shake her head, bewildered. They followed the pipe toward a place where a rotten gate barred the road. The pipe, she could now see oil bleeding out of its old joints, even in the weak moonlight, ducked under the gate. They went over it. She thought his hands rather too intimate for polite company in their helping, and rejoiced at each touch. "If he doesn't stop, the top of my head will explode like the candle," she thought, and laughed. "Susan? 'Tis nothing, Will, only nerves." Another of those long glances passed between them as they stood on the far side of the gate, and then they went down the hill together. As they walked, she noticed an odd thing. Many of the pines had been stripped of their lower branches. The hatchet marks and scabs of pine resin were clear in the moonlight, and looked new. She pointed this out to Will, who nodded, but said nothing. At the bottom of the hill, the pipe rose out of the ground and, supported on a series of rusty steel candles, ran about 70 yards toward the abandoned building before stopping with the ragged suddenness of a battlefield amputation. Below this stopping point was what looked like a shallow lake of drying, tacky oil. That it had been there for a while, Susan could tell from the numerous corpses of birds she could see scattered across it. They had come down to investigate, become stuck, and stayed to die in what must have been an unpleasantly leisurely fashion. She stared at this with wide, uncomprehending eyes until Will tapped her on the leg. He had hunkered down. She joined him knee to knee and followed the sweeping movement of his finger with growing disbelief and confusion. There were tracks here, very big ones. Only one thing could have made them. "Oxen," she said. "Aye, they came from here." He pointed at the place where the pipe ended. "And they go—" He turned on the sole of his boots, still hunkered, and pointed back toward the slope where the woods started. Now that he pointed them out, she easily saw what she should have seen at once. Horseman's daughter that she was. A perfunctory effort had been made to hide the tracks and the churned-up ground where something heavy had been dragged or rolled. Time had smoothed away more of the mess, but the marks were still clear. She even thought she knew what the oxen had been dragging, and she could see that Will knew as well. The tracks split off from the end of the pipe in the two arcs. Susan and Will Dearborn followed the right-hand one. She wasn't surprised to see ruts mingled in with the tracks of the oxen. They were shallow. It would have been a dry summer by and large, and the ground was nearly as hard as concrete, but they were there. To still be able to see them at all meant that some goodly amount of weight had been moved, and of course, why else would oxen be needed? Look, Will said as they neared the hem of the forest at the foot of the slope. She finally saw what had caught his attention, but she had to get down on her hands and knees to do it. How sharp his eyes were, almost supernaturally so. There were boot tracks here, not fresh, but they were a lot newer than the track of the oxen and the wheel ruts. "This was the one with the cape," he said, indicating a clear pair of tracks. "Reynolds." "Will, thee can't know it." He looked surprised, then laughed. "Sure I can. He walks with one foot turned in a little, the left foot, and here it is." He stirred the air over the tracks with the tip of his fingers, then laughed again at the way she was looking at him. "'Tisn't sorcery, Susan, daughter of Patrick. Only trailcraft." "How do ye know so much so young?" she asked. "Who are ye, Will?" He stood up and looked down into her eyes. He didn't have to look far. She was tall for a girl. "My name's not Will, but Roland," he said, "and now I've put my life in your hands. That I don't mind, but mayhap I've put your own life at risk as well. Ye must keep it a dead secret." "Roland," she said wonderingly, tasting it. "Aye. Which do you like better?" "Your real one," she said at once. "'Tis a noble name, so it is." He grinned, relieved, and this was the grin that made him look so young again. She raised herself on her toes and put her lips on his. The kiss, which was chaste and close-mouthed to begin with, bloomed like a flower, became open and slow and humid. She felt his tongue touch her lower lip and met it, shyly at first, with her own. His hands covered her back, then slipped around to her front. He touched her breasts, also shyly to begin with, then slid his palms up to her lower slopes, to their tips. He uttered a small moaning sigh directly into her mouth, and as he drew closer and began to trail kisses down her neck, she felt the stone hardness of him below the buckle of his belt, a slim, warm length which exactly matched the melting she felt in the same place. Those two places were meant for each other. As she was for him and he for her, it was Ka, after all. Ka like the wind, and she would go with it willingly, leaving all honor and promises behind. She opened her mouth to tell him so, and then a queer but utterly persuasive sensation enfolded her. They were being watched. It was ridiculous, but it was there. She even felt she knew who was watching. She stepped back from Roland, her booted heels rocking unsteadily on the half-eroded oxen tracks. "Get out, you old bitch," she breathed. "If he be spying on us in some way, I know not how, get thee gone." On the hill of the coast, Rhea drew back from the glass, spitting curses in a voice so low and harsh that she sounded like her own snake. She didn't know what Susan had said. No sound came from the glass, only sight. But she knew that the girl had sensed her, and when she did, all sight had been wiped out. The glass had flashed a brilliant pink, then had gone dark, and none of the passes she made over it would serve to brighten it again. "Aye, fine, let it be so," she said at last, giving up. She remembered the wretched, prissy girl, not so prissy with her young man, though, was she, standing hypnotized in her doorway, remembered what she had told the girl to do after she had lost her maidenhead, and began to grin, all good humor restored, for if she lost her maidenhead to this wandering boy instead of to Hart Thorin, Lord High Mayor of Mahis, the comedy would be even greater, would it not? Rhea sat in the shadows of her stinking hut and began to cackle. Roland stared at her, wide-eyed, and as Susan explained about Rhea a little more fully, she left out the humiliating final examination which lay at the heart of proving honesty. His desire cooled just enough for him to reassert control. It had nothing to do with jeopardizing the position he and his friends were trying to maintain in Hambry, or so he told himself, and everything to do with maintaining Susan's. Her position was important, her honor even more so. "I imagine it was your imagination," he said when he had finished. "I think not," with a touch of coolness, "or conscience even." At that she lowered her eyes and said nothing. "Susan, I would not hurt you for the world." "And ye love me?" Still without looking up. "Aye, I do." "Then it's best you kiss and touch me no more. Not tonight. I can't stand if you do." He nodded without speaking and held out his hand. She took it, and they walked on in the direction they had been going when they had been so sweetly distracted. While they were still 10 yards from the hem of the forest, both saw the glimmer of metal despite the dense foliage. Too dense, she thought. Too dense by far. It was the pine boughs, of course, the one which had been whacked from the trees on the slope. What they had been interlaced to camouflage were the big silver cans now missing from the paved area. The silver storage containers had been dragged over here, by the oxen presumably, and then concealed. But why? Roland inspected along the lines of tangled pine branches, then stopped and plucked several aside. This created an opening like a doorway, and he gestured her to go through. "Be sharp in your looks," he said. "I doubt if they've bothered to set traps or trip wires, but 'tis always best to be careful." Behind the camouflaging boughs, the tankers had been as neatly lined up as toy soldiers at the end of the day. Susan at once saw one reason why they had been hidden. They had been re-equipped with wheels, well-made ones of solid oak, which came as high as her chest. Each had been rimmed with thin iron strips. The wheels were new, so were the strips, and the hubs had been custom-made. Susan knew only one blacksmith in the barony capable of such fine work, Brian Hookey, to whom she had gone for Felicia's new shoes. Brian Hookey, who had smiled and clapped her on the shoulder like a compadre when she had come in with her Dawes shoe bag hanging on her hip. Brian Hookey, who had been one of Pat Delgado's best friends. She recalled looking around and thinking that times had been good for Cy Hookey. And of course, she had been right. Work in the blacksmithing line had been plentiful. Hookey had been making lots of wheels and rims, for one thing, and someone must have been paying him to do it. Eldridge Jonas was one possibility, Kimber Reimer an even better one. Hart? She simply couldn't believe that. Hart had his mind, what little there was of it, fixed on other matters this summer. There was a kind of rough path behind the tankers. Roland walked slowly along it, pacing like a preacher with his hands clasped at the small of his back, reading the incomprehensible words writ upon the tanker's rear deck. Citgo, Sunoco, Exxon, Conoco. He paused once and read aloud haltingly, "Cleaner fuel for a better tomorrow." He snorted softly. "Rot. This is tomorrow." Roland. Will, I mean. What are they for? He didn't answer at first, but turned and walked back down the line of bright steel cans, 14 on this side of the mysteriously reactivated oil supply line, and she assumed a like number on the other. As he walked, he rapped his fist on the helpless fascination, stepped forward again, and stopped. She remembered what he had said with a kind of horror, that he would do anything for her, but share her with another man. She would not, perhaps could not, break her promise to Mayor Thorne, and it seemed that Roland would not, or could not, break it for her. And here was the most horrible thing of all. Strong as the wind of Ka might be, it appeared that honor and promises they had made would prove stronger. "What will ye do now?" she asked through dry lips. "I don't know. I must think, and I must speak with my friends." Will you have trouble with your aunt when you go home? Will she want to know where you've been and what you've been doing? Is it me you're concerned about, or yourself and your plans, Willie?" He didn't respond, only looked at her. After a moment, Susan dropped her eyes. "I'm sorry. That was cruel. No, she'll not tax me. I often ride at night, although not often so far from the house." She won't know how far you've ridden?" "Nay. And these days we tread carefully around each other. It's like having 2 powder magazines in the same house." She reached out her hands. She tucked her gloves into her belt, and the fingers which grasped his fingers were cold. "This'll have no good end," she said in a whisper. Don't say that, Susan." I do. I must. But whatever comes, I love thee, Roland." He took her in his arms and kissed her. When he released her lips, she put them to his ear and whispered, "If you love me, then love me. Make me break my promise." For a long moment, when her heart didn't beat, there was no response from him, and she allowed herself to hope. Then he shook his head, only the one time, but firmly. "Susan, I cannot. Is your honor so much greater than your professed love for me, then? Aye? Then let it be so." She pulled out of his arms, beginning to cry, ignoring his hand on her boot as she swung up into the saddle, his low call to wait as well. She yanked free the slip knot with which Pylon had been tethered and turned him with one spurless foot. Roland was still calling to her, louder now, but she flung Pylon into a gallop and away from him before her brief flare of rage could go out. He would not take her used, and her promise to Thorin had been made before she knew Roland walked the face of the earth. That being so, how dare he insist that the loss of honor and consequent shame be hers alone? Later, lying in her sleepless bed, she would realize he had insisted nothing, and she was not even clear of the orange grove before raising her left hand to the side of her face, feeling the wetness there, and realizing that he had been crying too. Roland rode the lanes outside the town until well past moonset, trying to get his roaring emotions under some kind of control. He would wonder for a while what he was going to do about their discovery at Sitco, and then his thoughts would shift to Susan again. Was he a fool for not taking her when she wanted to be taken? For not sharing what she wanted to share? If you love me, then love me. Those words had nearly torn him open. Yet in the deep room of his heart, rooms where the clearest voice was that of his father, he felt he had not been wrong. Nor was it just a matter of honor, whatever she might think. But let her think that if she would. Better she should hate him a little, perhaps, than realize how deep the danger was for both of them. Around 3 o'clock, as he was about to turn for the Barquet, he heard the rapid drumming of hoofbeats on the main road, approaching from the west. Without thinking about why it seemed so important to do so, Roland swung back in that direction, then brought Rusher to a stop behind a high line of run-to-riot hedges. For nearly 10 minutes the sound of hoofbeats continued to swell, sound carried far in the deep quiet of early morning. And that was quite enough time for Roland to feel he knew who was riding toward Hambry, hell for leather, just 2 hours before dawn, nor was he mistaken. The moon was down, but he had no trouble even through the brambly interstices of the hedge, recognizing Roy DePape. By dawn, the big coffin hunters would be 3 again. Roland turned Rusher back the way he'd been heading, and rode to rejoin his friends. We will stop there, and we will pick up on Chapter 10 next weekend. Thank you guys so much. Sorry today's reading was later, but again, we are going to continue to go on Super Munchkin's schedule this weekend, this summer, because she outranks everyone. However, next week we will finish part 2 of book 4. So we're almost done with part 2, and then we'll be on to part 3. Alright, I hope you all smile bunches and laugh lots, and don't forget to have